From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and your family are sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back in the grill room just as soon as conditions permit. One of our guests in the grill room in years past is our speaker today, the esteemed Herb Motley. He wrote the book on IODs, and he's still racing in the IOD fleet in Marblehead, Massachusetts. This is 45th year of service in the class. Herb Motley, my good buddy and great sailor, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Herb, when's the first time you ever got on a sailboat of any kind? Where was it?
North Haven, Maine. We used to go up and visit my great-grandmother for my father's vacation. The North Haven dinghy is the oldest continuously raced one-design class in America, starting back in the 1880s. And my great-grandmother won the first race. She was written up in Sail magazine 100 years later to give her credit. So on the other end of the family tree, one of my granddaughters, Abi Borggaard, is on the varsity sailing team at Tulane, which won the intercollegiate mixed open regatta this spring.
So it's nice to know that your great-grandmother got a recognition, if only 100 years late. When's the first time you ever got on an international one design?
Well, I think it was 1977. I was crewing for Don McNamara, who was a very good sailor, bronze medal winner at the Tokyo Olympics in 5.5 meters. He was known as a tartan. He lived in the Hat where I lived for a while, and everybody we knew in the Hat had crewed for Donnie once. Despite the reputation, I had seen the IODs when I was a kid sailing turnabouts at Marblehead Race Week back in 1957 or something like that. So I was bound and determined to go out and get on one of these boats, to crew in a hot fleet. And my approach to McNamara was said to myself, well, if I keep feeding him information, he presumably is going to have to at least digest what I've had to say before he yells at me.
This was your thesis?
This is my modus operandi for dealing with McNamara.
When did an IOD first buy you or get control of you?
Good question. For many years, I considered myself the Commodore referred to as the OPBYC, which is the Other People's Boats Yacht Club. We had a World Championship scheduled in 2001 in Marblehead. And as you know, the World Championships, the boats are provided by the host fleet, and there's a rotation so that you sail a different boat in every race. One of the boats in our fleet had been sitting on a trailer for 5 years. It became sort of a question of, if not me, who, if not when, now kind of things. We wanted to get this boat going again. And so I went over, looked at her with Bruce Dyson, who had his marlin spike in his hand. And he said, well, everything in her sound, all wood is sound. She's a 1959 hull. She's one of the later hulls, wooden hulls. And he said, but she needs to be refastened. So I had a conversation with her then owner, who had a fiberglass boat at the time, and persuaded him that his wife's idea of boat's value could be moderated, shall we say. And I don't even remember now. I think it was about 6,000 to 7,000. The boat came over to my yard in about December. We had a barn raising bee. Many of the fleet came over and put up a framed 2x4 shed, which we then covered with shrink wrap, and so that she was there, ready for the winter. My answer to climate in Massachusetts in the winter was I got one of those propane heaters. And so I'd turn on the propane heater until my eyes smarted, and then I'd turn it off until my fingers froze, back and forth. And we finally got her in the water about this time, middle of July that year. And lots of pumps and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately she did float. My good wife, Terry, had questions. When we went out sailing, there was a nice steady trickle of water that ran from the rudder post down into the bilge. And it was visible enough to be upsetting to the lady of the house. And I tried to explain to her, darling, that's why God made electric bilge pumps. And anyway, we did get her going. We did get her sailing. We raced a few races in the August series. And then, of course, we had 23 identically tuned IODs on moorings in Marblehead Harbor. And then came 9/11. Our regatta was scheduled to start on 9/16. All in all, we decided to postpone till the following June. And that year, the class had 2 world championships, one in June in Marblehead and one in Bermuda in October, I think. But anyway, that's when I got into it. So I had the boat from basically 2000 to about 2018. I was given a cruising boat by a singing friend of mine. And quite by surprise, but I decided that this was probably a good idea. So I gave my IOD to my crew. So she continues to be competitive. The only thing that they did that was really strange was, as you can see from my yellow shirt, that was our color, our hull color. And the new owners painted her light blue immediately.
Now, tell me, let's look at your deck and let's learn about this historic class, the International One Design.
Friends and neighbors, I'm glad to share the history of the International One Design class. What you're going to see today is a presentation based on a book I wrote with Sandra Vitelli from Northeast Harbor and Dana Jenkins from Vermont to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the class. The history starts with a series of team races between Bermuda and Long Island Sound, Larchmont. And this wonderful picture shows it was a painting. And in that time, the 2 fleets were similar, but not identical. Long Island Sound had a boat called an Interclub. Bermuda had a Bermuda One Design. They were very similar in size. And every 2 years, I think it was, they brought one fleet north or the other fleet south for a week of team racing.
How would they get IODs, or what were then Bermuda One Designs, up to Long Island Sound and vice versa?
The Queen of Bermuda was the way you got to Bermuda in those days. And the shipping company very graciously carried the boats on deck back and forth to make the event happen. It was a much smaller, simpler world in those days. But here you can see the 2 boats sailing together. The foreground is the Bermuda One Design, and the Sound Interclub is just upwind of her. And you can see they look very similar. And they were, the Bermuda One Design was designed by Starling Burgess in 1926. So these were an era when boats were expected to last maybe 10 years. Here's another shot of the Sound Interclubs. The Interclubs had more sail because it was typically lighter air in Long Island Sound. Some of the balance of racing there usually went to the home team. The Bermudians would get their own back when they came back to home. In about 1930, 31, Bjarne Os, the Norwegian yacht designer, designed 3 identical One Design 6 meters for racing in Bermuda. And the 6s were the big class and the prestige class. Several years later, he built a boat called Saga, which you see here. Saga is still sailing up in the Pacific Northwest. This was started the love affair. Corny Shields saw this boat sitting on the mooring as he came into Hamilton Harbor. And as he said, he had never seen such a pretty boat before in his life. And so this was the design idea for the IODs. Here's the old man himself. He designed particularly 6s and 8s. I think he only designed 1 or 2 12s, but he was a very distinguished and successful naval architect in Norway. And so Shields started talking to him about doing a shorter, simpler version of Saga. Corny was concerned that the sound interclubs were getting a little tired after 10 years, and he wanted to make sure that they had all of the top sailors in Long Island Sound racing in whatever their selected fleet was. And so he decided to take a step ahead of the world and create a new boat before it was necessary to get people out of the interclubs. These are the plans of the boat. As you can see, she's a distinguished looking, slim, trim hull, and these are the quick looks of the lines and offsets which came out of Plan 1 from OS. Corning and a couple of other New Yorkers who had sufficiently deep pockets in the Depression decided that the way to get this off the ground was to order 25 boats. And with this impetus, Bjarne Os set up really a production line for building internationals. When you can see the shop here on the left, there's the beginnings of a boat with the floors in place and the stern post in place. And up overhead, you can see boats moving down the assembly line in various degrees of completion. So they churned these things out. I can't remember exactly. I think they said they could build one in 20 days. Mind you, this is wood, not glass. This picture here is Eileen, which was Corny's boat. She's one of the boats moved up to Nova Scotia 10 years ago. You would have seen her in Larchmont up until maybe 10 years ago. She was active there. Yeah. Tony Houston had her, I think, the last. And then sort of towards the end of the story is the creation of a fleet up in Nova Scotia, where they have some wonderful craftsmen, and they have made an art of taking some of these old derelict boats that need a lot of work and bringing them up and putting them in their sheds for a winter or more. So they have a marvelous fleet of, I think, 12 boats up there now. Each one has their own sort of history of mythology of where they came from. This is a modern picture of Eileen, as you can see from the winches on the port side and the cam cleats and so forth. But this also gives you, this is pretty accurate in terms of what the cockpit looks like on the traditional boats. The boat was delivered in 1936, and Corny had her put together at City Island, New York, and then Boxing Day after Christmas, sailed her to Larchmont. And that's when we start the clock, and we say it was the beginning of the fleet. The full racing schedule began the following year, 1937. We have a trophy for the Worlds in second place, which was the first trophy won by an IOD. There was a weekend series in 1937, and Arthur Knapp beat Corning on a tiebreaker. Arthur Knapp was, of course, quite a character. He was the navigator for the J-boat Ranger in the America's Cup that year. While he was racing against Corny down in New York, Ranger was being towed down from Bath, Maine, where she was built. And halfway along the way, some of the rigging came loose and she lost the mast overboard. And they had to start all over again with the rigging of her. But clearly it didn't hurt her at the end of the day. These are some of the original fittings. This boat is called Bumblebee. This was Arthur Knapp's boat. And you can see the pump under the step there, the bilge pump, and the wheel on the right are fine-tuned jib tunes and so forth. Arthur Knapp wrote a book called Race Your Boat Right, which is was a sort of a racing textbook. I think he published it in the 50s. And much of the illustrations and so forth is based on International One Design sail trim and how to make her go and so forth. And so this picture is one of what came originally from out of that. We have a world championship every year, as you know, and the traditional prize for the last place finisher finisher is a copy of Race Your Boat Right. The last time he was up here, Geordie Walker, who from Bermuda, who was one of the real class leaders over the time, won the book or lost the book, whichever you want to say. And Geordie came up to accept it, and he says, "This is the 4th time I've won this bloody book. And as you can see, it has done me absolutely no good at all." One of the great marketing tools, I think, for our class was Morris Rosenfeld. He took lots and lots of pictures of the Long Island Sound fleet. As you can see, a wonderful example here. Dark clouds, up sun, perfectly grouped sails.
But those look like smaller kites to me. And notice the cut of the kite too. This is before tri-radials came along.
Yeah, they're symmetrical.
Right.
Yeah, this was probably back in the 40s.
Mm-hmm.
Corny was the real genius behind this whole program. I think somebody in Larchmont was on the board of Time magazine. So Corny made the cover of Time. He had a number of things he was involved with. He was involved in the setting up the Interclub frostbite dinghies. He designed, of course, the IODs. And then he designed the Shields class. He won in 6 meters and 12 meters, but would always yield on port tack to another young skipper. After a little campaigning, I managed to get him listed in the International Sailing Hall of Fame.
What was the relationship between Corny Shields and Arthur Knapp?
The strong thing about our sport, they were great friends and great rivals. Corny's son, Corny, sometimes known as Glit, who died 2 years ago, I think, was also very much involved in the racing scene there. And I think that Corny, Glit and Carroll became much more involved with the Shields class, and they sort of drifted away from the IODs over time. But anyway, some real giants.
So who named the International One Designs? Was that Bernet O's who named him?
No, it was Paul Shields, Corny's brother, who was also in the investment company and so forth. And the international part was New York and Bermuda. And then, of course, once this program was started, the OCR built a lot of boats for Norway. They had some boats before the war that went to England. So they were really quite successful. Somebody asked Bjarne Os, sometime during the war, he said, "How many boats have you built?" And he said, "I haven't any idea. They just kept coming." The fleet of 6 IODs went to Bermuda in 37, and they started the team racing back again, but they didn't have to take the boats back and forth because the boats were all the same. There were other team races between Bermuda and Norway, and Norway also raced against the fleet at Cowes, and there was also some team racing between Long Island Sound and Marblehead as late as the 1980s. So here's a picture of the Bermuda fleet joining in. This is after the masts were changed. Bill John, who was Corny's successor as fleet captain, they decided they wanted to go to aluminum masts because the wooden ones are getting so uneven with the wood over the time. And so they got Ted Hood to design a different rig for them. And so the rigs that are in Long Island Sound and that are in Bermuda have a single spreader, jumpers have a broader angle, and the fore triangle is larger, so the jibs are bigger. And as you're quite right, the spinnakers are too. So this was some of the Bermuda racing. Bermuda has traditionally had a Bermuda Race Week the end of April each year to sort of start off the season. And they welcome one representative from each of the fleets with this International Race Week. In the UK, there was a fleet at Burnham and Crouch. Then this fleet moved to the Solent after the war. And then in the 70s, many of those boats were bought by members of the Royal Firth Yacht Club in Scotland, in Edinburgh. Then the Royal Northern and Clyde Yacht Club near Glasgow also bought boats. And so the Scottish fleet had boats on both sides of the country, back and forth. In recent years, Scotland ran into some tough economic times, and a lot of the younger guys who had been racing IODs lost jobs and all kinds of things. The remainders of that fleet are down in Cornwall at St. Mawes. This is a wonderful picture of a Marblehead mark rounding with all kinds of different boats in there. But the International is, as they say, to luck and timing. The hull, the design was absolutely magnificent, but they came along just as a sort of a crossroads. The top racing meter boats and so forth were all development classes. They had like a 12 meter. They had rules that would govern how much leeway you had as a designer. The meter classes gained ascendance over what we called the universal rule in this country. And the International was a meter boat, but it was a one design. They would all be the same. It would not be rendered obsolete by next spring's new design. And another thing which was important was the sale purchase plan, which has now been adopted by a number of other fleets. Under this program, within a fleet, everybody buys one new sail a year, and it's the same sail from the same sailmaker. In the old days, when the fabrics were a little more stretchy and so forth, they'd make the sails up and so forth, and then they would measure them all, and then they would draw lots to see which owner got which sail. Here's a Marblehead picture with our famous lighthouse, 2 or 3 of the original boats. There's my boat in her yellow form. In about 1980 in Marblehead, we decided to get aluminum masts for our fleet. We didn't choose to use the Ted Hood design because it didn't stand up in Bermuda. They lost a lot of them. So we got this J80 section, but it was perfectly remarkable. We had 26 boats racing in Marblehead back in the late 70s, and they raced many times in what we kitted 2 divisions. So now we have the same boats, the same mast, the same sails, and it just brought the whole fleet together and made the competition much more even. There was some resistance to buying the IODs in the 30s. People were concerned about sending their yachting investment money overseas during the Depression, but the price was $2,700 on this, landed in the US with sails, and so they really couldn't beat it. Dick Homer used to say, a new IOD has always cost about the same as a new Cadillac. And, in Marblehead, we all have identical spinnakers. We have lots of different classes racing, so if you have everybody has the same spinnaker, you know who you're racing against out there on the water. There's another shot of the IODs. Northeast Harbor was another fleet in 1938. They had 14 boats that were delivered by a freighter and unloaded by a crane into the Great Harbor of Mount Desert. And many of these boats are still racing. They have a fairly short season in Maine, and they of course have magnificent craftsmen up there. So they've been taking care of them good.
So the first IODs that got delivered from Norway did they come to Larchmont or did they come to Bermuda? Where was the first, the second, and the third load of boats?
In this sequence, Larchmont first, because Corny bought all those boats, and they twisted some arms in Bermuda and built 6 or 7 for Bermuda in that first year. And then the second year, Arthur Knapp in 1937 was Ranger, and the other Jays made a tour of the East Coast. And so Arthur made a big pitch up in Marblehead for IODs. And the same thing happened in Northeast. So those 2 fleets started in 1938. Then after the war, here's San Francisco with your iconic bridge and your iconic beautiful boats. And in this case, they started with number 75 in the San Francisco fleet. There's a familiar boat. Does she leak?
Youngster only leaks water.
Oh, good. All right.
Water comes through her. Most of the water gets out of her. A lot of the water stays there for a little bit and then goes out.
There we go. Anyway, well, I've had some fun.
Youngster only has 3 electric pumps.
Good.
The crew has often suggested we could use more, but she only has 3 electric pumps. I remember when I was a young guy sailing with Jake Wosser once, we were on a starboard tack and we were sailing up the bay. It's windy as heck. And I'm bailing inside the boat. I looked up to him and I said, because I had seen these plunger pumps, these gray pumps.
Yeah.
And I said, I can get the water down in here, down in the bills with these pumps. I was trying to tell him about this newfangled idea. And Jake said, shut up and just keep bailing. And I said, Jake, I'm trying to tell you there's an idea. I can get the water out of the bottom. He said, Ron, I don't want the water out of the bottom. Just get the water up there by the floorboards.
Yeah. Well, there's Jake.
The San Francisco Yacht Club. That is Roger Eldridge to the left there, giving Jake the trophy. That's Susie to the right. I remember this.
I have read the deed of gift from Bjarne Os for this trophy, and there is nowhere in the deed of gift any mention of the fact that if you won it 3 times, you got to keep it. But Jake won it 3 times and said it was his. So another trophy had to be built. And if any of your San Francisco friends have any idea, this trophy hasn't been seen since. If anybody knows where this original IOD cup is, certainly the class would love to know. Jake was a terrific sailor, and I remember hearing a wonderful story that one spring he had the boat up on the yard, and he started pulling things out of it, and the other members of the class were concerned that he was reducing the weight of the boat and completely going against the one design purpose. When he got her all done, they put her on a scale and she weighed in exactly the way she should have been. So I think Jake liked to pull people's chains. But anyway, there was another time story, or maybe life, I can't remember, about sail training in international one designs. Swede Whiten bought 9, I think 8 or 9 boats, had them built. And one of the things they did was they shortened the cabin so that the cockpit was bigger for racing. And this picture actually was published in Time. So anyway, a lot of improvements were made to make the life of the boats last longer. Corny himself was averse to fiberglass. The Atlantic class had gone to a fiberglass hull, and the two new hulls came to the Atlantic Championship Regatta, and they were so much lighter and tighter and so forth that the wooden boats were just non-competitive. So when the international one design class finally moved to a fiberglass hull, they very carefully did the specs so that the weight distribution was actually the same for the fiberglass boats as it is for the wooden boats. Olin Stevens gave them some help, and it became a much more family-friendly boat that guy didn't have to spend all weekend, every weekend, putting the thing back together again. The great tribute to this process is ever since the fiberglass boats and the wooden boats have raced absolutely evenly all around the world. This was the first boat that came to New York. 3 were built originally in Norway, and this was Jim Bishop's boat. Bishop's boat was loaned to the Worlds in Marblehead, and the success of the fiberglass was determined because she scored 8th out of 16 entries right in the middle of the fleet for her various finishes. Here's Thornton Clark. We lost Thornton a month ago. Thornton was in the travel business, and he could go around the world and look for IODs. But when Osyard in Norway went bankrupt, Thornton organized a group to buy the tooling and the molds and all the design rights for the class. Here he is shaking hands with Odd Hals, who was Bjarne's son-in-law at the time of making this happen. But Thornton really did a lot for pulling all this class together. Here's some original tooling. There's the keel mold, which is now down in Providence. Here's a rudder, and there's one of the machine shops. Thornton's own experience was a little different. He had one of the original Long Island Sound boats, which he'd brought up, and she finally opened up and sank. And so he went to Henry Coates, who was building the glass boats, and he said, "I want a fiberglass hull," which is here. You can see with Phil Somerby, one of his crew. They brought the hull down to Marblehead and took all the parts off the old wooden boat, the keel, the rudder, masts, everything else, and became number 108, eighth fiberglass hull, which she's still sailing under back into original number 16. This was a pattern which several other people did. They said, I've got a lovely boat that's falling apart, and I just don't want to spend the time to work on it. So they built several hulls like this, which they put the original hardware and, as I say, onto a new hull, maintaining the continuum there. Particularly with the fiberglass boats, more communities were interested in IODs. One of the first ones to pick it up was Fisher's Island. Boots Barker was a big proponent of the IODs. She purchased 2 boats. There was another boat there already, and several of the Burnham family got into IODs, and the fleet grew quickly. So the beginning of a growing fleet, number of fleets. Racing in Fisher's Island is pretty tough because you've got John Burnham, Kevin Farrar, Charlie Van Voorhees, and now Kevin Farrar's son, Jonathan, who's married to an Olympic sailor. And that's the first father and son team to win. I got to imagine that Saturday afternoons on Fisher's Island Sound are going to be pretty tough competition. Nantucket is another now relatively recent fleet. They were invited down to Bermuda to do a team race with Bermuda. And then they came up to host Bermuda, and they raced them in Indians or some small boats like that. And the Bermuda guys teased the Nantucket guys and said, "Hey, you ought to get a real sailboat up here." And Peter McCausland in particular, but several others, took the advice and looked at a number of different possibilities and decided that the IOD would be the best for them down there. They've got a lot of wind down in Bermuda and Nantucket. And so they built a big fleet of about 16 boats, but they don't own their own boats. They have an association, the Nantucket IOD Fleet Association, and you buy a share in the fleet, and then they put teams together and they race a different boat every Sunday, so that it's like a Worlds. They have the most, I say it's the big capitalist playground of the East Coast, has the only communist fleet in the IOD fleet. So anyway, there's Nantucket. Here's another shot of all their boats the same. They are all named for different birds, and they have a lovely time down there. One of the boats that Jennifer Miller, her father, and then she maintained this lovely boat called Topaz, which was the only wooden boat in the Long Island Sound fleet. And she would come and she would compete in a lot of the different regional regattas and so forth. She was a class officer. This boat, I believe, has gone to Northeast Harbor. Bruce Dyson rebuilt her twice, so she's still in lovely shape. Here's Jim Bishop Sr. He was a major supporter of the IOD fleet, and they took the one design sale purchase plan into the J44 boat fleet, and they have a complicated way of making that work. But we lost Jim 3 or 4 years ago. This is Tonsberg, Norway, the 2005 Worlds. Not the one, Ron, you and I sailed, but a wonderful setting there. Another fleet member who I just learned that we lost within a week or two is Jan Petter Rode, who was very much the leader of the Norwegian fleet and big financial supporter as well. He also had a boat in Bermuda. He just loved the sailing and loved the class. So again, we're sad to lose him. This is one of the funny things somebody called the almost one design class. These are 2 Norwegian masts. The further one has been re-rigged to the proportions of the Long Island Sound rig with a higher 4 triangle. And this is more traditional. Northeast Harbor is the only fleet that still is regularly racing with wooden masts. And they have all kinds of contention over whether they should ever move them. They're certainly not one design. Some of the guys got together and built a carbon fiber mast, which you see here. So again, the question is, do we want to build a third mast, a third one design? And that remains dormant at the moment. We lost Sandro Vitelli, who was one of the big proponents and technical proponents in Northeast. We lost him about 6 years ago. I did race with him on this boat, and it was pretty light winds, but we certainly ran away from everybody. There's some of the Swedes. hosting the European set of bowls, and they've been building fiberglass boats over there for several years. Gray boat on the left is Woodlouse, which owned by Urban Rustop and several others. And as you can see, the boys don't take everything too seriously when the racing is over. Here's the magical moment, as I say, when the hull is completed and the mold comes away, and there's a new boat. And these guys are doing a good job up there. Then Chester, Nova Scotia, it looks very much like Maine, which is not to be surprised. And they have assembled, I think, 11 boats up there now. Many of them are old woodies that have been restored by some of the very gifted builders up there. This is Kevin Farrar measuring the hull of Enigma. There she is, the most recently built wooden boat. We built her up in Chester. I was pleased to go up with Kevin and Charlie Van Voorhees for the measuring days. The other new fleet now is Manhattan Yacht Club on the Hudson River for 5 or 6 years now. It's a commercial sailing program, and but they persuaded a number of their guys that they'd like to have IODs down there too, and so those are individually owned, not by the club. So we've got that fleet is added to the world class roster. Here are a couple of other recently departed members. Dick Kemp was a good sailor and also a judge for many of our world championships. I mentioned Geordie Walker earlier. Geordie was a Commodore of the Royal Bermuda, but also he's the one who ordered a second set of molds to be built so they could build boats in Bermuda, and they built 15, I think, IODs down there, and then those molds were sent to Europe. Well, this was the 75th anniversary. These are our Marblehead spinnakers. Bob Duffy is another great IOD sailor. He's owned 2 different boats and been the world president. He's a respected international judge and umpire for match racing.
So I think Bob Duffy was with us when we raced 40-something years ago. How many years were you worldwide president, Herbie?
I did it. I had 2 different stints. One was, I think, one for 3 years and one for 2. We try very hard to have the rotation in the offices on a 2-year basis. And I think one of the reason I went on longer on my first term was because of 9/11. We didn't have an AGM, we didn't have a meeting because we didn't have a championship that year. So I just carried on until the next one.
So how much does a new IOD cost these days?
I don't honestly know, Ron. One of the issues that we have, of course, is because the boats are heavy, they're overbuilt so that they race evenly with the woodies. Means that we use a lot of fiberglass and that's, a big cost item.
You can buy an IOD in the 40,000 range, a used plastic one, and you can buy wooden ones, depending upon what their condition is, full range of prices. But people can get into the fleet in the 30, 40,000 range to get going. And a set of sails, mains are around $3,000, jibs are like 1,500, spinnakers are like about 2,000, depends upon where you buy them. But especially if you buy them in a fleet purchase, those are ballparks to give anybody an idea.
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate.
One of the really wonderful features of the Clas that I'd love you to talk about, Herbie, is when a world championship happens, we trade boats either every race or every day, depending upon how well we can move people about on the water.
That's right. And I think that was appealing to the Nantucket fleet about the way they set their, what I cheerfully call their communist fleet up there. The IOD, the hulls are quite identical. The rigs within each fleet are identical. The sail purchase plan means that each boat has the current sail, may not have been bought that year, but current sail for that rotation. The boat owner has discretion in terms of how he wants to set up the boat, the rigging and the sail trim and all that kind of stuff. I know that if people go aboard your boat, they get totally confused by all the strings. Mine is much simpler. Some boats seemingly had more control than others, and the fairest way to even that out was to have a different boat every race, which for the most part is done, certainly in the world. The North Americans or some of the other regattas, they may go to a one-day routine. But the theory being, therefore, is if you have a boat which appears to be either particularly fast or not particularly fast, you only get it for one race.
Herb, it's been just terrific talking to you about the International One Design class. People who are interested can look up www.IODWCA, which stands for World Class Association.org, and learn more about this historic, genuinely unique One Design class. Herb, historian of the IOD fleet, how many times have you been the tactician in the World Championship boat?
Well, Bill's won the world's, I think, 10 times. I've been aboard for 3 of those, and I've certainly at least that many when we didn't win. So I've been around for a while, and then of course a couple of times I've had the pleasure of going as a designated Marblehead skipper, including that memorable week in Norway several years ago with you and all. I had wind up with all the Californians as crew. It was great fun.
Thank you very much for representing the International One Design class so well in this presentation with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. It's been great having you as our guest.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.